welcome back, everybody, to 50 Sussex. Also, those of you joining us online, on the live stream, on the Walrus YouTube channel. It's great to have you here from across Canada and beyond. So our next panel is going to switch gears to talking about how we build resilience against climate disinformation. So there's a growing global movement that is being led by civil society actors and increasingly also by governments and international bodies to try to protect climate information integrity. The EU, in fact, has called for a universal definition of climate disinformation. Canada has, if we heard in the last panel, been cracking down on greenwashing, and the International Panel on Climate Change has formally acknowledged its own impact on policy for the first time. So this next panel explores these efforts at building resilience, responding to the reality of climate disinformation, but also is going to spotlight or turn the spotlight on lived realities of people around the world. So I want you to join me in welcoming our moderator, Molly Thomas, who some of you have seen on TVO, the program Big If True. And it's wonderful to have you here to introduce our next panel. Thank you very much.
It's great to be with you here today. Thank you to both Jennifers and the Walrus, and of course the Max Bell School of Public Policy. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. Our entire show, Big If True, is focused on misinformation, disinformation, conspiracies, and hoaxes. So if you haven't checked us out, Sunday nights at 8 on TVO, and of course we're online, Big If True TVO on YouTube. So climate disinformation fits into many, many of the categories that we focus in on our show. And we have an all-star panel here to talk about the resilience that we have to build against these disinformation strategies. So right beside me, I have Andrea Cairola. He has been the Chief of Section for Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists at UNESCO. Right beside him, we have Juhi Sohani. She's the Manager Director of Action Collab, which looks at systems thinking, a way to tackle this problem. Beside her, we have Adam Lynes-Ford, is the co-founder of My Climate Action Plan, involving civil society to tackle this. And then we have Geoff Dembicki here as well, an investigative reporter and global managing editor of Desmog. Please welcome our panelists. So since it's after lunch and I want to keep everyone awake, I'm going to keep this panel pretty open, okay? I want it to be conversational. I want people to jump in. And so Caitlin from the Walrus team is going to have the mic, and she's going to be walking around. If you have... It's back to that mic? Okay, so they have to go to the back? Yeah. They have to go to the back. Okay. If you have a burning question, if it's around the topic that somebody's on, I want you to come right up to the mic. I'm going to include you right in the discussion. I just think it's nice to stay focused and get you to the expert that we can, and then we can all be present and be here. Okay, let's get into it. Andrea, let me start with you. You are looking at this problem from a global perspective. So what is our greatest defense against disinfo strategies, when you look at it from that global point of view?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. We're glad to be here. Good afternoon to everyone. I am coming from UNESCO headquarters. As you know, UNESCO is the UN agency in charge of building peace in the minds of men and women through education, science, culture. And in our constitution, there is also the fundamental role of the free flow of information. So actually, I come from the branch of UNESCO which is dealing with the specific issue of media development, access to information, media information literacy, safety of journalists. So we see from that perspective the issue that have been discussed also this morning in terms of the magnitude of the problem of disinformation related to climate change, what Professor Welsh said at the kickoff of the conference about the scale, the magnitude, also the fast changing nature of it. I would maybe add also that, it's climate at the crossroad, but also information is at the crossroad. Why? Because the traditional, let's say, so-called mainstream media, legacy media, as we all know, have been passing through a perfect storm in terms of lack of viability, in terms, of course, of moving of media consumption to different users, the content creator, the news creator, but this is only a part of it. The other part is that, let's say, the triple crisis, the climate, the biodiversity loss, and the pollution is a triple crisis plus plus. There is the information environment crisis, and there is also the media crisis. So what to do, concretely speaking? So from our perspective, we have developed a roadmap out of an exercise that built, of course, on, let's say, decades of work of our organization, but in the various areas, but has been, let's say, put together last year, the World Precision Day. We have the honor to organize every year to spearhead the global conference on the World Precision Day, 3rd of May. Last year, the topic was Press and the Planet. And this roadmap has a number of resilience, as you said, measure, which concern the response for the media sector in terms of policymaker and then in terms of citizen. So I don't know if you want me to go into all of these.
Let's go through. I mean, from the journalist's perspective, like, are you telling me that credible information is at risk constantly?
Yes, it is. There are different dimensions of this crisis. Of course, there is the disproportionate risk to be an environment, a climate journalist. So ahead of this, we did a survey together with the National Federation of Journalists, finding out that over 70% of environmental journalists have been suffering some sort of attack. The attack can range from the killing. We unfortunately have the Observatory of Killed Journalists, which is the official, let's say, UN statistic related to an indicator as the G1610-1 and the Agenda 2030, and there are at least 45 journalists that have been killed because of recovering environmental issues over the last 5 years, which are more than the previous one. But then there is, of course, the safety risk in terms of for instance, judicial harassment, in terms of psychosocial well-being, etc. So what to do in response to that? For instance, let's take a concrete case related to the judicial harassment. There is a mechanism created by Canada and co-funded by Canada and other donors called Global Media Defense Fund, which last year had the first call dedicated to supporting legal defense of environmental journalists. And through this call, there are over 15 grassroots organizations around the world that have been supporting this legal defense. For instance, creating a peer support network among women journalists covering environmental issues in the Amazonas, or legal defense in West Africa and Sahel.
So when the lawsuits come, there's some money to help them out. There's some legal expertise.
Sometimes pro bono as well, because there are media lawyers specialized that they join, they have the capacity, and there is, through this mechanism, there is actually a response to that, because the isolation, of course, those that are more, I didn't say that, among those that are environmental journalists that are more exposed to attacks are, of course, those that are local, freelance, and those that are investigative journalists, because here we have some in the panel investigative journalists. As we know, investigative journalism is nothing other but good journalism, but it's essential to unveil the greenwashing, to unveil the illegal logging, to, of course, also unveil the mechanism of disinformation, because to do investigative journalism, and more, at least this is, let's say, a good story, if you see in this perfect storm of the media, is that now collaborative investigative journalism has been growing around the world, and it's real. It involves all the countries. I've been a regular participant to what is called a Global Investigative Journalists Conference, and when I was there, I myself as a journalist many years ago, and I was young, 20 years ago, there were just a few hundred people. Now there are thousands. I was at the last edition of this conference.
So there is a mobilization.
There is a mobilization in that sense, yeah.
Okay, I want to come back to the governance and the citizen side after, but one of the things from your report that I saw that was interesting was that there was more than 300 attacks that occurred between 2019 and 2023 on journalists, and that's a 42% increase on the preceding 5-year period. So it is getting worse for people that want to report on this issue. Geoff, let me come to you, because you are an investigative journalist, okay? You are the type of person that Andrea's team, UNESCO, is trying to protect in many ways. Your work on the petroleum papers, your book, incredible research that shows, how big oil has had so much power and so much influence, and they knew about the risks of climate change back in 1959, and they just ignored it. When I look at that, whether we agree with the outcomes of what has happened, those strategies were extremely successful. Like what they did, what they have done for decades, like it's a winning strategy. So what can we learn from them? Can we learn anything from them?
Yeah, and I think in the question of climate disinformation, I think it's important to remember it doesn't just like come out of nowhere. It's not like just this thing like, oh, disinformation. It always serves a purpose, and it's always put out to protect some sort of vested business interest or industry. And in the research I was doing for my book, The Petroleum Papers, it became very clear that a lot of the oil companies in Canada and in the US and globally who were going to be most impacted by climate policy, they understood how that policy would affect them way before the general public had any idea even about climate change itself. And they very strategically created campaigns to try to confuse the general public and make them think that climate policy was going to destroy the economy. And we're sort of like living with in the legacy of all of that. But there was a very clear business case to be protected, which came before the disinformation spread through all sorts of media channels.
So how do we fight back, Geoff, against groups that have exceptionally deep pockets, are well organized, and their message is very sharp?
Well, my thinking on this is changing a little bit, and I know there was a lot of talk earlier about sort of deplatforming, people spreading misinformation, regulating it, coming up with government penalties, consequences. And I think that there's like a time and a place for all of that, but that also sits a little bit uneasily with me as a journalist who really believes in free speech and just wants people to be able to say whatever they want and critique any sort of person in power. And we're seeing right now in the States how the Trump administration is sort of like weaponizing a lot of these tactics against people who are trying to do pro-climate work or any sort of progressive organizing. And I think in one sense, the anti-climate movement, if we can call it that, they've been able to get their message out in digital spaces like on Facebook or through podcasts, YouTube or whatever, in a way that hasn't really been challenged because pro-climate voices haven't really been in those spaces at a level loud enough to really offset any of this explosion of climate disinformation we're seeing. And so my thinking now is we've sort of all got to get into the media spaces where the disinformation is having the most impact and not worry so much about crafting like the perfect climate message or something that will just immediately unlock the policies or behavior we need, but instead just trying to be as loud as possible in those spaces. There should be like 100 pro-climate influencers across the country in every sort of new media platform or distribution channel, just being loud, repeating the message over and over that we need strong climate action.
So is there an army of influencers, climate influencers, that is organizing in some capacity? Because when you look on the other side, you know, I looked at some Yale research that said 8 out of the 10 most popular shows online with climate disinformation were we're spreading disinformation on climate change. Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson topping that list, okay? So we know that those voices have the most eyeballs. So is there an army of influencers or anyone organizing that at any level to combat against it?
Only in sort of very small, modest ways, and I think that has to change. I think there should be, I mean, if there are any funders in here, just start putting so much money into creating that army of influencers, but also towards funding high-quality, independent climate journalism. Like DSMA, give us money. Because if you have thriving, independent climate media that can produce high-quality information, and then you can link that information up with people who can package it into engaging or informative ways on whatever sort of new media platform that they have audiences on. That's a way to really start competing with all of the disinformation coming from the Jordan Petersons of the world. And one other point I'll make on that is we kind of view social media as this kind of like unserious fringe thing in comparison to like serious like legacy media, the Globe and Mail, broadcast networks. But in reality, new media, or whatever you want to call it, is the mainstream now, and conservative voices like Jordan Peterson and other people who spread anti-climate disinformation, they've sort of realized that ahead of the climate movement, and they've built a massive followings on platforms like YouTube. Jordan Peterson has nearly 8 million followers, so he, in a sense, is mainstream media. He's bigger than a lot of broadcast networks in Canada.
For sure. Juhi, on a systems level, is anybody thinking about that new media and the new media landscape? Because it feels like we're a little bit late to this, like way late.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've heard about a lot of people anecdotally intervening in elections by trying to organize influencers that are progressive leaning. We've seen those kinds of attempts here in Canada. What is difficult is, again, Geoff's right, if there are funders in the room, think about it. But also I think what is really interesting is that influencers kind of live in communities, right? Like we already have access to a lot of influencers, and in all of our attempts to be like, we want to reach women, we need to go in to places where women are already self-organized. Book clubs, Zumba classes, faith-based groups like religious institutions, you will hear me talk about that constantly, community centers. I myself was a community center kid. Like, I went, it was basically a way for, same. It was basically a way for my mom to have me taken care of for a couple hours. So now I can kind of draw and kind of skate, and I could at one point play Old MacDonald on an acoustic guitar. So if you need any of those skills done poorly, hit me up. But what was really interesting is that kind of influencer power actually already exists, and often women are those influencers. Like the other fellow community center moms were where my mom got direction. And then at the mosque, that is a high trust environment, right? That is a place that helped raise my family and many others out of poverty because it was distributed in its organizing. You have these networks of masjids across the country that are leaning on each other financially. And then also, they build a lot of political power, right? Those are community influencers. Like if you are in touch with an imam, you're in touch with 15,000 votes, right? And so how are we accessing those high trust environments, and how are we accessing those trusted messengers like those imams and like those elders in community? And then how are we turning them into the influencers? That's my question.
That's interesting. So you're saying it's not only online, it's like tapping into the networks that are already there and we may already be a part of. Juhi and I were chatting at the back during the last session, but the anti-network, I want you to talk about that quickly.
Oh, I would love to talk about the anti-network. My colleague, Batul Ghulam Hussain, and I have been talking about deploying an auntie network. And if anyone here has aunties to whom they're connected, those are powerful, powerful people, right? They will get you married. They will get you a doctor. They will get all your problems solved.
They will do that in 2 weeks.
They will do it.
It is not a joke.
It is not a joke.
It is not a joke. Very powerful.
Yeah,
in cultural communities, these things are like sometimes overlooked.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Michael was talking about how the oil and gas lobby is putting $600 million into disinformation, but they cannot touch the aunties on their phone calls gossiping. If you tap into an auntie network, you're able to combat disinformation because, again, it's a high trust environment, right? The way that we see political power deployed across an auntie network is phenomenal. If you need to know if a vaccine is good or bad, you're asking an auntie, the auntie is asking whoever she trusts in community, right? Which is very powerful because that kind of information spreads like wildfire. I hate to use that term, but it does, right? If you're hearing about whether or not climate change is a hoax, you're asking a trusted messenger in your community, and that's often an auntie who's like, I heard from my son that climate change is a hoax, right? So how are we trying to like reverse that power? And honestly, it is by re-entering those kinds of communities that already have built interdependence and are already self-organized. So again, funders that are in the room, we can be funding that kind of embedded organizing, right? Because those kinds of communities already exist and are often overlooked. And I actually think, Molly, you should talk a little bit about the Christian community in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying that, I come from a Christian background, and I think if you look in the U.S., especially the evangelical Christians have been monopolized to a large extent over certain different subject areas, right? Which they are just aligned. And where was that trust built? It was built inside the church. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that's a different issue altogether. But the fact is, like, how was it done? So I do think even when there are outcomes that we don't like, there are ways to look back and say, what are they doing that we can learn from, and actually mobilize that for good, credible, research-based information. I just want to remind people, questions. You can come on up anytime to the mic, and we will get you involved in this conversation. Adam, I want to get you in on this. You are thinking about civil society at large, and how can you involve people against disinformation. What do you find is really working right now?
Well, I'll eventually get to the antis as well, but I'm going to start a little above, which is, for environmental non-government organizations like mine, one of the things that we realize about this moment in the climate times that we live in is that we need to do two things at the same time. We need to advance climate policy really quickly, and we need to support people who are living through the impacts now and the impacts that are going to come. And the good news for us in that work is that the majority of people care about climate change. They believe it's real. They want governments to protect our communities, and they want governments to bring down pollution. That's to our favor. The challenge, again, for organizations like ours is that we have been reaching only about 15% of that majority who care, and those folks are the most alarmed and engaged about climate change. Those are people who are the most resilient to disinformation. That means there's a whole other 40% of folks in Canada who believe in the science, who want governments to act, but who are not hearing from organizations like ours. And that leaves them wide open for disinformation. And so we use the 5 Canadas framework from ReClimate and Eco-Analytics. So we focus specifically on the civic nationals and progressive liberals in that 40%. And interestingly, when we look at where those folks are, they tend to live in the most politically powerful places in Canada. So they live in those ridings that are really close and decide who forms government. So they've got some outsized policy power. They also tend to live in the places where we build a lot of our renewable and fossil fuel infrastructure. So they are very powerful from that perspective as well. And many of those regions are experiencing some of the most intense climate impacts. So if we want to move quickly on climate policy, we really need to learn how to connect and build trust with those folks who are not currently reaching.
And how are you doing that? Are you finding anything successful?
Yeah, so one of the models that we have based our work on is the beneficial membership organization model.
Okay.
So what that means is we look at, okay, for civic nationals, for example, where are they encountering climate change? It's not at the emissions cap policy level. They're encountering climate change when it's really, really hot in their town. They're encountering climate change when there's more wildfire smoke in their community than they've ever experienced, and they're wondering whether they should let their kids go outside. So that's the place where we meet them. Mm-hmm. So with information, this is what you should know before you decide whether to let your kids play outside. Here's the things you need. You can get discounts through us on air filters and other things. You can join a workshop of ours and learn how to set up a heat buddy network in your neighborhood to look out for one another. So that is working, Molly, in that we're offering that direct connection in where people are encountering climate. From there, we can then bridge into the policy. So that's where we get into our advocacy campaigns. Well, what policies would help to protect our communities better from wildfire? What would help us to build out clean Canadian renewable energy in this region?
And you're involving everyday people in those discussions so that it's not something new when it pops up on the policy platform, of a politician.
Yeah.
Let me get to this gentleman who is waiting so patiently.
Oh, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to put questions in the conversation. It's a great idea. Chris Beale with Disarm Foundation. So one thing I really appreciated what you're talking about is this, like, meeting people where they are, which feels to me like has to be the solution. And I'm just curious, outside of the climate conversation, a lot of the people I've been talking to have been looking at civic tech or even civic AI solutions. And I've some examples that I've worked on that are really effective. And I just would note, especially Carl Miller's Waves, which is based on V-Taiwan, which is launching in the UK with Demos a couple weeks ago. Are there civic tech solutions that, you talked about the influencers. Are there like specific organizations that are driving solutions to building consent, like consensus-oriented ways of looking at these challenges, trying to find ways to meet people across divides that are effective, or do we still need to, because it just feels like even this conversation today is very focused on like us and them kind of creations. I'm just wondering if there's something you've come across that you find effective. And Juhi, you talked about this in Ottawa a couple weeks ago. I'm just wondering if there's more to bring up in terms of that space. Thank you.
So tech solutions,
I mean, I think that, thank you, Chris. Nice to see you. I actually think that Adam and I are both approaching via, I guess, trying to embed ourselves in, I guess, tech in a way by reaching people via social media. I think that, like, all of the community resilience that we build is in service of, again, the information that we get, like Geoff said, via social media, which has kind of become the big actual primary news source for most people, and then also leans on traditional media, and then all the research and wonderful stuff that everyone is actually doing to, like, build up a base foundation of information. And one of those things is that via different channels, online channels, we do try to bring people together across political divides under identity-driven, I guess, like, engagement mechanisms.
So give me an example of that.
Yeah, so one example of that is we participate in an online channel called Stand Up for Canada, which was kind of revived around the time of the election with, all of the fear around a Trump government below the border and this kind of like renewed energy around Canadian sovereignty, which did lead to a lot of people kind of like accessing an identity that they hadn't accessed in a long time, which is kind of like the proud Canadian. And that allowed us to reach a lot of people that had been disaffected for a long time because they had found a way to feel galvanized together about something. And in that, it is really the business of cultural translation, right? Like, we are posting memes and we are talking to people in a way that is a lot more digestible. And it also like emulates culturally what they're seeing in other online spaces. Maybe they are seeing posts from the Prouds come across their timelines, or maybe they're seeing other kinds of memes that their uncles and aunties are sharing. And so we're trying to emulate those, but we're trying to talk a little bit about what does it look and what does it feel, especially like, to access progressive nationalism. And that is something that, like, I think is a bit of a political bridge, right? Because like we talk a lot about meeting people where they're at, and then bringing them to where we are, but we don't tend to have a lot of those like online spaces that are that bridge for people whose politics are still developing or that feel safe in a different kind of online environment. And I think that Adam's team at My Climate Plan is doing something very similar by speaking the language that is accessible to folks. Mm-hmm. It's a little de-jargonized. I think that on Stand Up for Canada, that team is also desanitizing the type of language that they're using to be accessible to real people. So I don't know if, Adam, you want to talk a little bit more?
I can give a concrete example also. In the lead up to the most recent federal election, we ran Facebook ads, meta ads, targeting centrist liberals, most of whom are women, most of whom are spending a lot of time on Facebook, with ads that were focused on keeping Canadian energy and our economy as strong as possible given the rift in our relationship with the United States. That was something that really resonated with that audience, and a lot of them then came and joined us through those ads. The next step we did is engage with them on the issues that they came to us on. And we told them, we're looking for people to talk with 5 or more of your family and friends about the stakes in this election. And this is the thing about these folks, they're like, they're civic nationals for a reason. They like to get out there and organize. So they almost all said, we had hundreds and hundreds of people across the country say, yeah, I'll talk to my friends and family. When we asked them, what do you anticipate as being the #1 challenge to doing that? By far the thing that they reported was, I will talk to my niece or I will talk to my neighbor, but I know what they're doing online and I don't think I can get through to them. Mm. Interestingly though, they still signed up and they still had the conversations. When we spoke with these folks afterwards and asked how it went, the majority of people said that they were surprised that they were able to have as productive conversations with their friends, their family, their neighbors, than they thought they would. And so that was a real lesson for us, that if we don't help to facilitate connection between each other, what we know about climate concern, which is most people believe they care about it more than others, plus the perception of other people being influenced by disinformation, means fewer and fewer of us are going to talk to each other. And fewer of us then are going to have that experience of our own assumptions being debunked via the process of connecting with other people.
Actually, could I say something on that too? Just to build on what both of you said. I think those are like really amazing, like inspiring examples. And I think what we need to do is like scale that now in the digital spaces where everyone is getting their news, like on Facebook, for example. And I think this kind of gets to what you're saying. It might seem like a lot of the people sort of like whipped up into this like anti-carbon price or anti-climate frenzy are kind of unreachable. But I think that's because there's just no one else engaging with them where they're at. Canada Proud, you mentioned, they are by far the biggest megaphone for climate disinformation in the country. They reach millions and millions of people through Facebook. And I've spent a lot of time on the Canada Proud page. I don't recommend it per se. But a lot of it is just acknowledging the very real challenges that people are facing in their lives. So Canada Proud, they're constantly acknowledging how expensive it is, how difficult it is to raise a family, how hard it is to get a home. They talk about stuff like wildfires and how disruptive they are. So they're acknowledging people's like actual material reality and then steering them towards these explanations and solutions that result in all of those problems becoming worse. But what I realized spending so much time on that page was a lot of these people, if you meet them where they're at and acknowledge the real material concerns in their life, and challenge the narrative of like a Canada Proud and point people in really positive pro-climate directions, I think you can shift public opinion really quickly. And to give one quick concrete example of that, I used to live in New York City, and right after the recent election, everyone was like, oh my God, New York is going right. It's becoming like MAGA, it's Republican. Magazines sent reporters out into the deep boroughs and were interviewing immigrant communities who had turned towards Trump. 6 months later, a Democratic socialist won the mayoral primary with those exact same demographics. And it was because he was willing to go into those communities and respond to their real concerns and then channel them into a much more positive direction.
It can work just one-on-one. I just want to come back. Can someone give me a time check? I forgot my phone, and I know that I have a time. 2:19. Okay, we got time till 3, so come on up with your questions. I want to come to Andrea because I know you wanted to weigh in on the gentleman's question about the civic tech solutions, like from a global level. Is AI a part of the conversation? Is it slow to adopt something, or where are we at?
Just would like to react to what Chris said, but also what was said before about the importance of research to mention that as UNESCO, we've been promoting together with UN colleagues in Brazil a global initiative for information integrity on climate change, which is exactly one of the area of work is to find this kind of innovative solution through research. I won't touch much on that because the next speaker after in this session is Charlotte Scandon from the UN DGC, which will be detailing more about this initiative. And then if you allow me, about what was said about the community, etc., also to remind that part of this resilience has to do with the importance of supporting media and information literacy. And nowadays will be also more and more, of course, literacy on Gen AI and all the indispensable now skills and competencies that are necessary. And there is a lot of room for data at formal education level, but also informal and non-formal, because if you talk about all these communities, it's a challenge of every parent nowadays to deal with the kids. And for instance, there are new professions that are coming out, such as like digital parenting, a coach, or stuff like that. So providing, let's say, the window of opportunity is to interact with this community to provide a support to respond in terms of quality media information literacy, which is of course empowering the citizens themselves to decrypt, recognize, and tackle online disinformation.
And what seems to work, Andrea, and what seems to not work? Because media literacy is wide, and especially when you're coming at it from the UNESCO, UN, a big body like that. Like, what is working in media literacy?
I think what is working is when it's really responding to real needs and when it's done within the existing mechanism. So for formal education, for instance, over the last years, like in Nigeria, they created a mechanism to train teacher trainers are trained on media information literacy. While in Brazil, they've been training over 700,000 teachers. So again, this at formal level. While at informal level, it works actually to work with existing networks and to respond to start as can be Gen AI, can be of course the challenge of being a parent, and then reacting to that, of course, give, let's say, the full package of media information literacy to build this resilience within the citizens. Of course, it's not about to give the burden all on the citizen, but to equip them to have, of course, the critical thinking which is part of the defense against the online disinformation.
Yeah, which is what we're trying to do too. Let me come to one of the questions at the mic here.
Yes, thank you. I've been thinking about this is all super, super useful, and I'm just wondering how do you make it stick? Because sometimes I've had conversations with people in my network who don't necessarily believe all the things that I believe, and I'll convince them on one thing, one time. I'm like, oh, the wildfires this year are insane. And they're like, yes. And then we talk about it. But then they'll kind of go back to where they're comfortable. And they kind of slide back into continuing to watch the Jordan Peterson and be very inspired by all of that. So how would you recommend making it stick in a more sustainable long-term way than just having a one-time interaction?
Really consistent long-term funding is... But I mean, yeah, there's all of these really interesting experimental kind of one-off campaigns to communicate about climate change to people, and it seems like it's working. People will get good results, and then the funding will dry up, and people will be like, okay, well, we tried that. The thing about these disinformation networks and the megaphones like Canada Proud or Jordan Peterson's podcast, these sources of media that are the mainstream right now, they just repeat the same message over and over and over again. One day when I was on Canada Proud's page, they just shared anti-carbon tax stuff 10 times in a day, and they're just doing that every single day. It's like watching a Canadian Tire advertisement 10 times during the movie you're trying to see on TV. Eventually you're just okay, fine, I like Canadian Tire. So in a pro-climate sense, I think we need to be on these mainstream platforms, just repeating the same message over and over and over again, and funding the people who can do it well.
And I think part of the challenge, in Canada, which is different from anywhere else in the world, is that we have Meta now blocking credible news sources from their social media sites. And so, that has its own interesting history in this country. But, we went through an election where people couldn't get CTV, CBC, your go-to places, the Walrus, they couldn't get that on social media. And we know that 40% of Canadians are going to social media for their news. And so things like Canada Proud
and what
fill
they
the gap.
could get was Canada Proud.
Canada Proud exceptionally benefited from that. But then, and people didn't know that these are not news sites. So I think when you talk about, climate influencers, like there is a space or a window of opportunity perhaps that is outside of the news people, because we cannot do that anymore on those sites. Like we are actually banned off of those platforms. This gentleman with a question, come on in.
Okay, I guess my question is sort of related to the first question, which is like bridging the gap between people. Well, it's not necessarily people on both sides capturing common ground. Basically, I was wondering, because it's sort of like it has devolved into a fight now where it's sort of like both sides are kind of labeling each other as misinformation or disinformation, and sometimes people on the other side, regardless whether it's us or them, they feel attacked because of that. So should we label it as misinformation or uncertainty? And then also my second part, sorry about that, is that me personally, I don't like being online as much. So maybe, and I don't know, like being online does feed into the doomerism kind of mindset nowadays. So I was wondering if you would, I guess you guys are a lot more online, so would you support people being more online and us pushing these counter narratives, or would you rather encourage people to just spend less time online and not be exposed to the other side as much?
Okay, let's separate those into two. So the first one, should we be labeling this as misinformation or uncertainty? And I think the last panel also touched on this, right? It's like that uncertainty is manufactured for a reason. We see that working so well in climate disinformation. We see it with vaccines, right? That uncertainty makes people pause. And that pause is enough to change how people react to things that we have, decades of research on. So are we labeling this wrong?
No, I don't think so. I mean, people throw around the terms all the time. But if someone is producing false information for any kind of political or economic gain, that's disinformation. And I think we should stick with that definition.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Are we labeling it wrong? Misinfo, or is it uncertainty? And should we be weighing into that uncertainty or saying, I don't know when we don't know? I know we don't like to do that. Journalists don't like to do that. Academics don't like to do that. No one likes to do that.
I actually think that there are two objectives, right? Like if your objective in trying to label or not label is to aid your perception, then absolutely. I agree with Geoff. I agree with everyone that, we should be labeling these things as mis or disinformation, because that's what they are, and it allows us to build our mental models around these kinds of things. But then if you're out, in community, like in your community groups, offline, I don't know where the person was that asked the question, but I absolutely think you should be offline. But if you're there, then what is some other language that you can use to be equally as dismissive of that kind of information, and not reinforce it by constantly talking about it? Because the more you talk about something, the more you reinforce its legitimacy. Cognitively, it continues to sit in your brain, right? But I know that there are other ways, other terminology, other languages, folks who speak other languages. You may not be using the language of dis or misinformation, but you may be dismissive of that kind of content in a different way. So what does that look like to you when you're talking to somebody who doesn't resonate with the language that comes from academic spaces, right?
Yeah, to build on that, Juhi, I think in the instances where you don't want to just be repeating misinformation or disinformation in order to refute it, which is generally not great communication strategy, what's really powerful is as trusted spokespeople. So for example, we work with a lot of wildfire fighters. Those folks don't say, it's not arson, or it's not geoengineering, or it's not the UN. What they do say is, I've been defending communities for decades. Over my time working in these forests, I've seen them get hotter and drier, and the fires are bigger than I've ever seen them before. We need to do something about climate change. You don't have to label the other things as lies. You find the people that are trusted authorities who are telling the truth.
And get one of those wildfire fighters and give them a podcast.
We're working on it.
I just want to quickly come to the second part of that question. Should we be fighting it online, or is it the in-person spaces, or is it both?
I'm in favor of both. So for example, I talked about connecting with those civic nationals through Facebook ads, where they're spending a lot of time, moving then through to asking them to connect with people in their communities. Many of those people ended up doing that in person. So for example, one of the people I phoned up afterwards and said, how'd it go? She said, well, I just made sure that I ordered the lobster that I distribute among my friends for election day, so that they had to come see me. And if they hadn't voted, I sent them away until they could get their lobster. So like, if you bring it down to the sort of community network level, that's where it starts to stick, because you're building, it's already sort of embedded within existing relationships.
Yes. You have one more thing to add?
I do. Very briefly, this also connects back to what Alex's question was right before this, about like, how do you make this stick? And it is often an exercise in addressing the social isolation that everyone is experiencing. And that's why so many people have a relationship to Jordan Peterson, is because he's talking to men about how they can feel less sad. And I think that what we're trying to do is trying to bridge online and offline. And if we are actually effectively making those deep connections, like I was talking to some of the folks who ran the Zohran campaign, and one of the things that worked best for them to get people out door to door was merch. Being like, here is something to reward you for coming out in real life and being around other human beings, is a free t-shirt. And you're talking about similar other kinds of rewards that actually start to like rebuild that trust in being out in community around people with whom you may not completely agree all the time, and feeling safe in that and feeling rewarded for doing that.
Maybe just very briefly also to mention an example of participatory projects that are taking advantage, of course, of the being online, but very much anchored in local reality. For instance, as UNESCO, we've been supporting Sandwatch, which was a global project for monitoring the status of beaches around the world, with kids from all over continents, etc. So that's a way to, let's say, connect what is now more and more difficult to distinguish also the online, the offline, as we are in the on life, as an Oxford scholar said.
Mm-hmm. Time check? Oh. 2:32.
I guess quick reaction and question that each of the things you're mentioning, if you're thinking of community activation, or Adam thinking about trusted individuals, or Geoff thinking about the groups, I think I can think of instances, particularly in Alberta, where each of those models have been drastically more successful pushing the other way. So community activation, I come to you from a measles epidemic. I mean, this is community, I think of trusted sources, and I think around COVID and how much more outsized the opinion of the one nurse or the one ER doc who was, anti-COVID or anti-vax had compared to the hundreds of others. Or in the space that Geoff's in, I think of the impact of Cody Battersill and Canada Action versus the environmental groups. Like, what is it that's differentiating some of those things that they're having the impact? I mean, one of the most influential policy people on energy in Alberta right now is a Calgary real estate agent who makes bumper stickers and sweatshirts. So why? Like, what is it about that makes it work?
Well, a few things. I think some of those organizations you mentioned, like Canada Action, very effective. I think early on they identified Facebook as a dominant source of news for people, not only in Alberta, but all over the place. And a lot of where their campaigns thrive, I think, is in smaller towns where local news has collapsed, and so they sort of get to have a monopoly on information. And And I know that there's been a resistance among a lot of climate people to view Facebook or other platforms as like legitimate sources of news or places where people should also be organizing or trying to create like engaging, entertaining pro-climate content. But I think organizationally, what groups like Canada Action and Canada Proud do really well is they serve as megaphones for information across the entire anti-climate movement. So if you look at their pages, they're always sharing each other's stuff. They're lifting it up. They're viewing the anti-climate movement as sort of a connected ecosystem. And I know in a lot of more progressive pro-climate spaces, people are sort of just like guarding their own like content a lot more. There's sort of less like sharing or like cultivation of an ecosystem. But that's something that the right is doing really effectively.
Andre.
I think you mentioned local news and the importance of local news. So we have something which is called World Trend Reports on Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists, which is observing trends. And one of the trends, of course, apart what we describe, is actually the news certification at local level. So maybe a question, how many of you, when, I don't know, 10 years ago, had 2 or 3 newspapers in your community, how many of you have now just one, or even not one? Probably most of you now have lost the pluralism, the diversity at local level. So what to do on that? Again, is a matter maybe of funding, and there is the importance of recognizing information as a public good, and thus actually investing public resources into making sure that there is this diversity and pluralism of professional news gathering and media at local level. Because without that, of course, we don't have the facts, and as Maria Ressa has been saying several times, I saw her picture was there, if you don't have facts, we don't have trust. If you don't have trust, we don't have a shared reality. And then, of course, without shared reality, we are back to the polarization that we were mentioning before.
Our first episode of our season 2 for Big If True is on news deserts and places where local news disappears, and that linked to misinformation. So hopefully people can stay tuned on October 26th. Please.
Yeah, so my question is basically the factor, since we are talking about journalism and influentials, the factor of monetization. When these journalists who are not affiliated and they go to social media and try to get more views and so that their channel or whatever can get monetized. Mm-hmm. So how common people can identify that their motive is more like more views, more money for them, and they would add the sensation to the content. But what are your thoughts for like random user that these more views are not, doesn't mean that is more credible? And the second question to Andrea is that you referenced the media literacy. So when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, how would you differentiate media literacy and critical media literacy? Because what we heard is media literacy is more like how to use media, different channels. But when it comes to critical, then it comes to the factor of like misinformation to be critical online. So your thoughts about like UNESCO's framework for that?
Okay, let's just divide that question up. So the first one, how do you identify bad accounts, bad information?
Well, it's tricky. But I think this sort of gets to what I was saying earlier about the difficulty of trying to go after disinformation by like demonetizing, deplatforming, labeling it disinformation. If someone is getting a ton of views spreading bad information, they've probably figured out some technique to engage people's attention, and we can watch that and learn from it and apply it in a much more productive pro-climate direction. So I think if we look at what sort of content is doing extremely well online right now, we can apply those lessons to climate messages. There's no reason climate content has to just be like really sober, serious, dry. I think we should take it as a challenge, an experiment with all sorts of media formats, make it fun, make it engaging, and sort of engage in sort of the same rules and the same strategies that a lot of the anti-climate people are using, and just be better than them at their own game.
Funding organization, I think, are the key points.
On the first question, actually, content creators, influencers, what's the name, bloggers, once upon a time, it's very complex because, of course, even the new viability model for news creator is there, because for them, for some of them, this monetization is an opportunity to actually produce news without an intermediary, like in the past. So whether we like it or not, whether they identify themselves as journalists or not, this is the new reality. However, the problem is that most of these content creators, for instance, we did a survey, and 2/3 of them, they share, they do not check before sharing. So they share, of course, that's not, you're a journalist, how professional require actually, of course,
fact-checking.
Fact-checking, etc. So one simple reply to that is for sure the need, for instance, to disclose the funding for all those that are producing a relevant amount of public interest information, which could be a broad definition to encompass content creators that have a certain impact, that are influencers because they have thousands or hundred thousands of followers. Well, on the other question about media literacy, actually I talk about media information literacy. So it's a broader concept, it's a concept which is evolving and fast evolving, I would say, nowadays, because it's exactly to encompass, for instance, also generative AI, etc. So it's not just about, let's say, the traditional media literacy or news literacy, it's media information literacy. So of course, it's not easy to keep pace with fast evolving environment, but it's supposed to respond also to these others. So not only, let's say, to allow you to reach out to the media, or the traditional media, or the legacy, etc., but beyond, to be actually a savvy and empowered consumer, because the right to freedom of expression is the right to not only to impart, to express, but also to seek and receive. And nowadays, the real issue in the new ecosystem is the issue of seeking and receiving information, because normally algorithm they are proposing us, we are not really seeking, we're not, what we receive is actually sort of imposed by, for instance, algorithm.
But then I wonder how much the platforms are the problem, and if we need regulation. Because these platforms are making big money off of the spread of climate disinformation. There was one researcher on my show that said something like $15 million a year from his research. Like, that is big money. There's no incentive to pull it back. So is there anything happening, either in any countries that you've seen or globally, in a way to be like, we need to put some guardrails on the big tech companies?
It's just really hard to do, and it often if you do have some sort of demonetization scheme or you deplatform people, someone else comes into power in government and they just start using all of those tools against progressive organizing, which is exactly what's happening in the U.S. right now. But yeah, I in response to Andrea, what you were to kind of build on it, I think it is just like media is just like a chaotic free-for-all these days. It's totally insane. It's hard to predict where it's all heading. But there is, more than ever, there's still a need for actual journalists and high-quality verified information to be at the base. And what I'm saying is there needs to be megaphones that can take that high quality information and make it fun and engaging and blast that out to people. And just as an example, during the Canadian election, we were working with this comedic YouTube influencer at DSmog. He's called The Goose. And he did something that I considered to be a miracle, which was he took this incredibly nerdy, wonky, sort of boring DSmog map that we produced and turned it into an actual, like, hilarious video. Like, no one at DSmog could believe it. We were like, whoa, he made us funny. How? And then I was talking to this guy afterwards, and I was like, you're incredible. Like, you got to keep doing this stuff. And he said that he really wants to do this full time, but he had gotten some funding to do a project and it fell through. So now he was pursuing little freelance gigs and he was unsure if he could keep this up long term. So that's what I mean about like the stable long-term funding. We have examples of how to do this right, and we just need to scale them up.
Let's get to these questions. I know we're fighting time now.
Okay, thank you very much for your dedication and your work. It's very inspiring. So I saw Jane Goodall just over a month ago in Toronto, and pretty much everything that came out of her mouth and the mouth of her incredible Youth Advisory Council just received thunderous applause. And I think Jane is loved for the way that she countered despair and inspired people to action, small-scale action. Which leads me to my question, which is, we have a number of climate agreements. Almost everyone has commitments on climate education. So we've touched a little bit on public education, teacher training. I heard that from our UNESCO colleague. And I know you wear a different hat, so this question is for everybody on the panel. What are we doing to implement those commitments on climate education in Canada and elsewhere? Thank you.
Let's start in the middle.
That's not something I know very much about, but I feel like Andrea looks like he knows something about that.
Climate education in terms of,
I mean, of course, there are these commitments. The challenge, of course, in the education system is the complexity, of course, of having these various commitments integrated and effectively. That's an issue. But I think a lot is happening around that. Sometimes it's packaged. For instance, there is a concept which is global citizenship education, which sometimes is comprising climate education and media information literacy education. The point is, in terms of effectiveness and in terms, of course, of implementation in, of course, normally what are among the biggest also employers in every country, because the education sector is huge, of course.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the climate education side? One thing I found really interesting, there's a group called Media Smarts here in our country, and they have, this last year, had a group of like teenagers that were employed to literally create fact checks and like fun, interesting things like Geoff was talking about. And I found some of those young people so engaging, like I want to get them on my show and like as a permanent part. But part of their thing was like, oh, we had funding for this one season. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you have young people talking to young people in the way that they speak and we don't have money to like fund them? You know, so I think that was one thing that I noticed, because I'm like, what better way to educate than have peers talking to peers?
Great. This hopefully builds on that. You know, a lot of conversations about resilience come up with phrases like, let's outcompete the bad information with good information. And so we, when we met our coalition with Facebook the first half dozen times, they said this was their philosophy. And so they built the Climate Science Information Center leading into one of the COPs. But we did an analysis and showed that the disinformer networks that we drew out from the DISMOG network outcompeted Facebook's own Climate Information Center by a factor 12 to 1 on their own platform. So in that environment, you know, how do we build resilience when it seems a Sisyphean battle in order to try and outcompete the bad with good?
I mean, yeah, it's not easy, absolutely. But I mean, as long as I've been reporting about climate change, I've seen only a very small fraction of examples of actually engaging climate content that could go beyond like the group of people that already care about it. And you see that reflected in Hollywood's inability to tell a really compelling climate story. I mean, Don't Look Up is maybe like the best example, but that wasn't even about climate change. It had to use a metaphor. And so I'm not surprised that the Facebook climate content unit got outcompeted, because I mean, I don't want to throw any shade on that without actually seeing what they were making, but I imagine the anti-climate people were probably just like a lot more fun or dramatic or crazy or like interesting to watch. And I think the challenge for us is like how do we create that level of engagement? But you're right, it's like it's not an easy thing to do at all.
I think the other direction is to look at where people are getting their content, where there's space for us. So, like, content companies, e-newsletters are a huge online business right now. They're growing massively. People subscribe and open them again. Nobody was opening email for a while. People are reading newsletters again. Our inspiration at my climate plan is the American Association for Retired People. They're a beneficial membership organization. Does anybody have a sense of what would you say the #1 read magazine is in the U.S.? Rolling Stone, something like that. It is the American Association for Retired People's magazine. I get it. So I know a lot about Harrison Ford. If anybody wants to come talk to me. They do good work. And what their magazine provides entertainment, Harrison Ford, information that people need about what it means and what they need to age well in the United States. They are the authoritative voice on what it means to age well in the US. And they have been extremely successful in influencing public policy over decades in the US, famously getting Obamacare over the line. So that authority to be able to talk about, this is what we need to age well, including what we need on the public services side, and get a very politically divided country and membership on board for that, is a pretty amazing example of what you can do with a piece of communications that is both in service to your readers and entertaining. And so our much more modest newsletter, starting here, is modeled on that exact premise. We provide information that is tailored to folks that are outside of that alarmed. Because as you say, Geoff, there's not a lot of that out there, right? The stuff that doesn't already assume that you would call something a climate crisis, that it's your top #1 issue, but rather, again, meeting people where they're encountering climate in their lives.
But to do that, Adam, you have to weave so many different components into that. Like, you're not just reading a climate article, you're understanding, like, it's like what else needs to be in there, like affordability, like what do those articles practically look like, I guess is my question.
So anything from the markets have been going bonkers lately. What do I need to know about, like, climate proofing my finances? People love the gardening stuff, so like, it's hotter than ever. What do I need to know about my front yard? And then there's a connection there to climate. There's a connection to what you're experiencing, but it's also just, entertaining and useful reading. Yeah. How do I talk to my kids about climate change is a very popular one of ours.
It is a very popular one. Please.
Thank you for the discussion. I'd like to ask about the role that we give science in this debate, especially science-based solutions. Like, we will position ourselves as the side that has science on our side. But the reality is that science can and is being weaponized a lot of times by the industry. And for example, I work in agriculture. And in agriculture, we'll see that scientific studies will simplify complex systems, for example, in one indicator, which is usually greenhouse gas emissions. And then we'll have studies that show that if we just measure methane and kilogram of meat produced, for example, intensive systems are better than extensive, and they don't account for externalities such as nutrient cycles or animal welfare and biodiversity. So how can we ensure that we take science holistically and responsibly when proposing solutions to these climate problems that we're facing? Thank you.
Anyone want to jump in on that?
I can start with part of it. I mean, I think to react first to the importance of academic freedom. Second, the fact that we spoke about the journalists that are disproportionately affected by attacks, threats, etc. But this applies also to the scientists. So there is a big issue in terms of the safety of scientists and of scholars and researchers, etc. So this is another aspect that needs to be tackled, because especially those that are dealing with this issue, they are again disproportionately attacked, for instance, to online harassment or other. And the other aspect is also, of course, the importance of let's say, international cooperation, of public funding to research, etc. So these are some, let's say, elements in reaction.
I'm looking for our Reclimate colleague in the room. My recollection is that scientists are still among the most trusted on climate, at least for Canadian audiences, along with NGOs, interestingly, and doctors. So, yeah.
Especially if they're speaking from their area of expertise, felt to be overgeneralized.
For Canada, and is there any
Canada,
research on that in the US? Because I feel like that's drastically different. We'll have to take a look. I mean, when you have, officials in power that are denying science outright, then it becomes that challenge. And I think that question is an interesting one. Let me just get to this last question because we got like 3 minutes left.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation about calling people in versus calling people out in the climate discourse. But I'm just wondering, because I'm feeling particularly like it's getting harder and harder to move beyond our echo chambers sometimes on both sides. And I feel like there's less tolerance in some respects for spaces where we can have public discourse that is more neutral, or just having those opportunities to call people in without, feeling like you're not going to be heard or you're going to be attacked, and people, rightly so, not wanting to have the responsibility of going into spaces where they might be in those positions. And so I'm wondering, do you have any ideas about how we can maybe build a greater tolerance as a society for public discourse where we can disagree, but it's not kind of in a weaponized way, and how we can build a greater tolerance in that respect.
Ideas on that?
Well, I think one way to connect with a lot of people who are outside of the climate world is sort of to acknowledge that we're just in a really anti-elitist, populist age. And a lot of people, whether you're right or left or all over the spectrum, have an innate distrust of big business and institutions. And a lot of that has been leveraged to fuel support for ripping up climate policy or doing stuff that's bad for the climate. But interestingly, I was doing some reporting in New York around how the Democratic Socialists of America, which is where Zoran came from, were engaging around climate change. And New York is, especially once you get out of Manhattan, it's very working class. It's not necessarily a super progressive place. And the climate activists, when they would go canvassing, they wouldn't talk about climate change per se. The way they would structure their conversations is they would go up to someone's door and say, hey, you know that utility that you have to pay all your money to that you hate and that gives you bad service? There's 2 really hated utilities, Con Ed and National Grid in New York. And people would be like, yeah, I hate those assholes. And then the DSA people would be like, well, wouldn't it be better if we had cleaner, cheaper, renewable energy? And then you could screw over those utility CEOs who are just taking your money and using it to buy a second vacation home. And people would be like, yeah, get those assholes out of here. And in that sense, a lot of people who may not agree with a full-on political disagreement on some sort of contentious issue can be brought along into a space when it's sort of it's when you talk about climate in a different way that taps into people's sort of innate distrust of institutions and business.
Quickly, yeah.
Yes, very quickly, maybe referring to an experience which is called the Social Media for Peace project, which was implemented in very different parts of the world, from Indonesia to Bosnia to Kenya to Colombia, which actually, to create these bridges, created national coalitions on the issue of tackling harmful content. And in this coalition, typically you have specialized NGOs on issues related to the governance of internet, freedom of expression, but also together with those dealing with climate, those dealing with gender rights, etc., as coalition to collectively interact, finding concrete solution with the policymakers, with, I don't know, the electoral management bodies when election come, etc. So these are some, let's say, experience also interacting actually with, where possible, with the representative of the digital platform towards a governance of the internet which is multi-stakeholder, right-based, and effective.
I think, you know, our last panel before this one, you guys were saying it was a spicy panel. And I think that's necessary. And I think that intelligent discussion and disagreement, if it's done well in these kinds of platforms, also has an ability to echo what's happening outside in the streets when you talk to the public and what people are hearing. So I think it's really important. And so thank you to the Walrus, thank you to the Max Bell School of Public Policy, and thank you to our panelists.